Hello and welcome back in the room, or welcome if you're just joining us online. My name is Sia Weiser. I'm Politico Senior EU Climate Reporter. Without further ado, I am going to introduce the man who's joining us now is Norbert Gorsen, the Deputy Climate Envoy of Germany, who was just negotiating at COP29 alongside Jennifer Morgan and the Foreign Minister of Germany, Annalena Baerbock. But beyond that, he's a real veteran of the COP process, so I'm delighted to have him here today. Welcome, Norbert.
Welcome, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So the landmark agreement at COP29 was promised by developed countries to increase the amount of annual funding for climate measures in poorer countries from 100 billion to 300 billion by 2035. Not everyone was happy with that, to put it mildly. There was quite some unhappiness after the gavel came down. So I think my first question for you would be, was 300 billion really the best rich countries could do?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I would say, it is important that this COP was close to complete balance. In the end, that we have an outcome. And the core of the outcome of this COP is, of course, the outcome on finance. 300 billion, and on the one hand, is a lot if you look at it from the perspective of donor countries. And it's, of course, not enough if you look from the perspective of developing countries who rightly request for more. But I think it's a good compromise. For the first time, we were able also to include finance from developing countries in this decision, which was a prerequisite for us to go that high in the end. And it was an agreement which was taken by all developed countries plus the new donors in unity. You know perhaps that the first draft proposed 250, and that was then increased to 300. Furthermore, I think it's important to mention that this decision is not just a number. It's also including a number of qualitative elements which are absolutely key for developing countries. So in particular, there will be a lot of work now starting to improve access to climate finance for developing countries. Access, how to get a better access, less burdensome access to finance from bilateral institutions, but also from multilateral institutions. Also to improve financing for adaptation, to increase concessionality, to reduce cost of capital. All those elements are now included in the decision, and they are absolutely vital for developing countries. And then there is a second number, which is the 1.3 billion. This is not a binding number. It is a number which addresses the needs of developing countries for climate action, both for resilience and for mitigation. And there is an agreement to set up a roadmap, so set up a work stream which will work towards how to achieve that. And that would include everybody. It would include all actors who can contribute. In particular, I would like to mention the financial sector, the finance industry, and not just government. So therefore, I think it's a acceptable compromise, and it's obvious that not everybody's happy. I have to say that in the end, there was a loud noise, in particular from India, against the decision. But it was not a lot of noise coming from all developing countries. So India was a little bit isolated in its complaint. We heard, of course, that many were wishing to get more, but there was also a clear recognition from many developing countries, or from almost all participants, that this COP was a COP where you had to come to an agreement, that it would be much harder next year to come to such a number. So therefore, I think it's the best we could achieve, and it should not be seen as a let's say, a groundbreaking, a historical decision, but at least a reasonable one, and one which offers a lot in these times, which is, as we all know, impacted by a lot of geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, was it that sense that it had to be at this COP, or was there what was it that made this deal come together at the end? Because the last day, it was very dramatic. The island nations walked out of the room at some point. Was there any particular moment, any particular decision that made it all click?
I think it's important to mention that the Azerbaijan presidency did not do an excellent job. They did not listen to the islands and to the LDCs until the last moment, and they walked out because they haven't been heard. So we had last-minute meetings together with the islands, the LDCs, the African countries, progressive Latin American countries, in particular to address those qualitative elements, and then it was also possible to raise the number in a combination. That was mainly due also to activities of the European Union. So EU Climate Commissioner Wopke Hoekstra, my minister Annalena Baerbock, they took a lot of effort in the last hours to bring them all on board, but it was not initially the strategy of the Azerbaijanis to do that. So therefore, we could have had a better presidency, and then perhaps this kind of drama could have been avoided. The presidency was not very transparent. It was biased. It was listening more to like-minded developing countries, in particular to the Saudis. It did not give anything on mitigation, which I think is a very, very important negative aspect of this COP, that this COP did not deliver on emission reductions. And only with these last-minute efforts we could achieve this important outcome on climate finance.
Okay, very interesting. Just to come back to that number, on Tuesday we had the Irish Minister Eamon Ryan here, and he told us he thought it should actually have been 400 billion. And then there's analysis coming out that, given inflation, also you mentioned all of these additional measures now as part of the target, developing countries can contribute voluntarily. There's not actually much more of a financial effort needed from developed countries. So is that really enough?
I already mentioned that it's not enough. That's why we have this second number there. But you also have to consider the situation in which donor countries are in. So we're not in a time where budgets are extremely well equipped. We are in a time where we have difficult discussions in our societies about spending money abroad. That's not only true for Germany, it's true for many donor countries, as I look to France, to UK, not to talk about the US. We took the risk of this number of 300 in the view of knowing that Donald Trump will be the incoming president, and that very likely from the US we cannot expect a lot of support for that. So therefore, I think given the situation we are in, it's an acceptable number, but I never would say it's a good number and that not more needed to be there. That's why we have the 1.3 trillion, which now need to be worked upon. What can we do to mobilize financial sector to move towards developing countries with its investments? How can we attract also adaptation measures to be financed by the private sector? What can we do more in order to improve the operations of the international financial institutions? What can we do in order to identify new sources of climate finance, etc.? So there's a huge agenda of activities which have to happen now outside the UNFCCC process, which can help to increase the numbers to what is needed.
Yeah, and I'll come back to the 1.3 trillion, but just one more question on the number, or the quantum as it was called there. developed countries came forward very late. They revealed their cards very late in the process, which also caused a lot of unhappiness. Do you think that was a good strategy, or looking back, would you have done it differently?
I don't think there was an alternative to do it in more or less that way, because you cannot put a number on the table at the first day of a 2 weeks conference or 2 weeks negotiation process. Then you would start negotiating about the number. And that would not have been possible. All donor countries, all contributors have to agree to those numbers in consultation with their finance ministries or their prime minister's offices. And they all have to have in mind that in the end, financial contributions will have to be endorsed by parliaments. So therefore, we had our strict limitations, and there was no room, let's say, to have a negotiation about 250 to 300, 400, whatsoever. That's not how it's going to happen. And please recognize that for the first time ever in the climate process, we have a number which is part of a financial, which is part of a decision. The 100 billion were put on the table voluntarily and outside the process to developing countries, and they were only then recognized thereafter. But it was not an initial decision to come with the 100 billion. That's different now. So that's already, I think, an important step forward.
Speaking of lessons learned, I think you were the negotiator for climate finance at the Paris Agreement talks for the European Union. And really, climate finance has become sort of the make or break issue of these COPs. It's pretty much every year it's a financial issue at the end. I guess this was true of this COP more than any other. But looking back, I mean, is there anything about the climate finance negotiations that then ended up constituting the Paris Agreement that you wish would have perhaps, ended up differently and would now make things easier?
There's one aspect which we were already discussing and negotiating strongly and heavily in Paris, and that was coming up again now, which is who has to pay. We have a definition of so-called developing country in the Climate Framework Convention from 1992. And already in Paris in 2014, 2015, we thought this is outdated. We cannot really explain to our parliaments, to our finance ministers, and in particular not to our public, that Gulf countries or China or Singapore should be counted as developing countries and have no obligation to provide climate finance. So that was a problem in Paris, and we had then in the end ended it with the formulations you can find in Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 9.3 at that time talked about the need of a global effort where developed countries would take the lead in order to mobilize climate finance. And that was what we now were implementing. So we acknowledged again that developed countries have to take the lead, but there are others who have to follow, and that's part of a global effort. And that's what we now achieved in the NCQG decision, in particular with Para 8, which now includes also the outflows of multilateral development banks based on the shares all countries have there, and that includes then China, Saudi Arabia, etc. So that is a little bit what we could achieve here. But the basis, the Paris Agreement, is what it is, and it was clear from the very beginning that we would not rewrite the Paris Agreement, but we would not amend the Paris Agreement, and therefore we had some limitations which were already based in the compromises we made in Paris.
Right, yeah. So the donor countries issue, the donor base, that was obviously a huge priority for the European Union, for Germany at these talks. And I was wondering, how did you perceive, in the corridors, in the talks, the willingness from countries like China, but also the Gulf states, but also South Korea, for example, to perhaps, step up in the future? Was there more of a willingness?
Yes, I think we used the whole year and also the years before to really have thorough and tough discussions with China, with Saudi Arabia, with Singapore, with Korea, to tell them, listen, we are not going to be able to convince our constituency, our parliaments, our finance ministers to do more on climate finance as long as you are completely off the hook. And the more we talked about it, the more it was understood that this is really serious for us. And it's not only Germany and the EU, it was the same also with UK, with Australia, with Japan, with US. They all had this same line. I think it was becoming more and more clear that they have to move. And I appreciate very much that in particular the countries you mentioned, China and South Korea, but also Singapore, they moved. During the COP, it was becoming clear that they wanted an outcome and that they wanted an outcome which would include them in a way without rewriting the Paris Agreement, as I said, and respecting their formal status as developing countries. That was not touched. But in that framework, they were willing to find common ground, and that's what we achieved. So therefore, this outcome is very important because it changed a little bit the paradigm which we were in before that COP.
And what about the Gulf states? I mean, at the last COP, which was hosted in Dubai by the United Arab Emirates, the Emiratis put forward, like alongside Germany, they boosted the loss and damage fund with 100 each, and that was seen as a very significant step. But this time, I don't know what you think about it, but you did really hear very much from the United Arab Emirates. How did you perceive their role and the other Gulf states in this discussion?
There's two dimensions of that. One is finance. In the end, you didn't hear a lot, neither from the United Arab Emirates nor from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states about finance. They accepted this. In the end, they were not fighting against this outcome. They accepted this and they were part of the deal. Not a very vocal part, but they were part of that deal. On the other hand, in particular Saudi Arabia, and that was unfortunately supported strongly by the Azeris, prevented any kind of meaningful outcome on mitigation. We were not able to repeat the notion of the energy targets we agreed last year of transitioning away from fossil fuels. That was blocked by Saudi Arabia, and it was blocked in particular because to some extent they felt like they have lost their face last year in the Emirates. And maybe that is a reason why the Emirates were a little bit silent during this COP, because they did not put the same kind of political efforts towards the deal this year than last year, when they managed to get the Saudis on board for a language which talks about transitioning away from fossil fuels. So that's the big downside of this COP. When we talk so much about the finance part, I think we also have to recognize that in a year when we have more and more increasing climate disasters and catastrophes felt and experienced everywhere on the world, that it's not really a good signal that this COP did not say anything about what's next on reducing emissions.
Just so I understand, you were saying that the Azerbaijani presidency was actively against restating this language from last year about transitioning away from fossil fuels?
I cannot say for Azerbaijan, but what I can say is they listened more to the Saudis than they listened to others. What their own opinion was, so I have some doubts about their impartiality. You may have seen the op-ed from the COP president, which was released after the COP, where they blamed the EU for not having put forward enough commitment on climate finance, and that more would have been possible. This is not really a very trustful and good faith activity from the presidency. We never saw something like that. That a presidency which should be neutral after a COP comes with an op-ed like that. And please remember, they have to be presidency for the rest of the year to come before COP30. So there's one more year we have to work with them. And this was really disappointing that these kind of things were coming out. So therefore, I'm not really convinced about the leadership of Azerbaijan during that COP.
Yeah, and indeed, looking forward at the next year, COP30 obviously shapes up to be I think the Brazilians called it the COP of COPs. It's taking place in Belém. There was this promise to, as you mentioned, reach or, eventually kind of like make good on these 1.3 trillion on this roadmap between Baku and Belém, as they called it. What do you think Germany and the European Union can do over the next year to help deliver on that?
This task is a task which will be led by the two presidencies, by Azerbaijan and by Brazil. We just started to think about it, and I tend to see it as an opportunity to really bring forward the big, I'm not sure whether I should call it a revolution, but the big change in mindset of the whole financial sector. We will have next year also a decision about Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which talks about aligning financial flows to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the roadmap is a very good complement because it will concretize in particular the part which is for supporting developing countries. So efforts from all actors in the climate actors are being needed, and I hope that both presidency, in particular Brazil, will bring everybody around the table. We will certainly be interested to play our part. I also know that colleagues in the European Union thinking the same way. So it's a huge opportunity to come out with something meaningful, which changes the dynamics of how finance will be mobilized in order to transform our economies towards becoming climate neutral and more resilient. And at the same time, next year's COP will have to address the new climate plans and climate targets. All parties to the Paris Agreement have to come forward with the so-called nationally determined contributions. In Baku, we already saw three countries coming forward with their plans. It was the UAE, it was Brazil, and UK put forward at least a number as a core part of its NDC. And now we have to see that all countries do their part and come up with ambitious NDCs which are aligned to 1.5, which are addressing all sectors in an economy, all greenhouse gases, and lead in particular with respect to the big countries towards substantial absolute emission reductions. Only by that we can still keep 1.5 in reach, and that is, I think, the intention of the Brazilian presidency with its COP next year, to demonstrate that this is still possible and that this is supported. So therefore, this roadmap will underpin the support side for this big transformation, great transformation.
Yeah, and on that note, we're out of time. Just a final question. I'm hearing that you're retiring from the Foreign Office, I think very, very soon, next week or this month, is it? Will we see you nevertheless at COP30 in another role, or was that it for you with climate conferences?
No concrete plans yet. So please let me first take a rest, and then we'll see what happens. Thanks a lot for this question, and thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us here, Norbert. Thank you.